Presented to you by Digital Archive. No Name. Wilkie Collins' haunting saga of secrets, betrayal, and a fortune stolen, but not forgotten.
William Wilkie Collins was born in London on January 8, 1824. From the age of 8 to 15, he resided with his parents in Italy, and on their return to England, young Collins was apprenticed to a firm of tea merchants, abandoning that business 4 years later for the law. This profession also failed to appeal to him, although what he learned in it proved extremely useful to him in his literary career. His first published book was a Life of his father, William Collins, R.A., in 1847. The success of the work gave him an incentive towards writing, and 3 years later he published an historical romance, Antonina, or The Fall of Rome. About this time he made the acquaintance of Charles Dickens, who was then editor of Household Words, to which periodical he contributed some of his most successful fiction. No Name, published in 1862, depended less upon dramatic situations and more upon analysis of character and the solution of a problem. That he was successful in his purpose is chiefly evidenced by the wide popularity the story received on its appearance. The main object of the story, he wrote in the introduction to the first edition, is to appeal to the reader's interest in a subject which has been the theme of some of the greatest writers, living and dead, but which has never been, and can never be, exhausted, because it is a subject eternally interesting to all mankind. A book that depicts the struggle of a human creature under those opposing influences of good and evil, which we have all felt, which we have all known. Like others of Collins' stories, No Name was successfully presented on the stage. Wilkie Collins died on September 23, 1889. Chapter 1. Nobody's Children. A letter from America, bearing a New Orleans stamp, had an extraordinary effect on the spirits of the Vanstone family as they sat round the breakfast table at Combe Raven in West Somersetshire. "An American letter, Papa!" exclaimed Magdalen, the youngest daughter, looking over her father's shoulder. "Who do you know at New Orleans?" Mrs. Vanstone, sitting propped up with cushions at the other end of the table, started and looked eagerly at her husband. Mr. Vanstone said nothing, but his air of preoccupation and his unusual seriousness, which not even Magdalen's playfulness affected, proved clearly that something was wrong. The mystery of the letter puzzled both Magdalen and her elder sister Nora, and in particular aroused a feeling of uneasiness, impossible to explain, in the mind of the old family friend and governess, Miss Garth. Though neither Mr. nor Mrs. Vanstone offered any explanation, Miss Garth felt more than ever certain that something unusual had occurred, when, on the following day, they announced their intention of going to London on private business. For nearly a month they stayed away, and at the end of that period returned without offering any account of what they had done on their mysterious visit. Life at Combe Raven went on as usual in a round of pleasant distractions, concerts, dances, and private theatricals, in which Magdalen cut a great figure, winning even the praise of the professional manager, who begged her to call on him if ever she should require a real engagement, passed the weeks rapidly by. To Magdalen also, the return of Frank Clare, the son of a very old friend of Mr. Vanstone's, provided an interesting interlude. As his father put it, Frank had turned up at home again like a bad penny, and was now lurking after the manner of louts. Though Mr. Clare's estimate of his son was frankly truthful, Magdalen loved him with all the passionate warmth of her nature, and when Frank, in order to escape being sent to a business appointment in China, proposed marriage to her, she accepted him joyfully. She urged her father to consent to their immediate union. "I must consult Frank's father, of course," he said in conclusion. "We must not forget that Mr. Clare's consent is still wanting to settle this matter, and as we don't know what difficulties he may raise, the sooner I see him, the better." In a state of obvious dejection, he walked over to the house which Mr. Clare occupied. When, after some hours, he returned once more to Combe Raven, he informed his daughter that Frank was to have another year's trial in London. If he proved himself capable, he should be rewarded at the end of that time with Magdalen's hand. Both the girl and Frank were delighted, but Mr. Vanstone did not reflect their good spirits. He wired to his lawyer, Mr. Pendrell, to come down from town at once to Combe Raven. So anxious was he to see his lawyer that he drove over to the local station and took the train to the neighbouring junction where Mr. Pendrell would have to change. Hours went by, and he did not return. As the evening closed down, a message was brought to Miss Garth that a man wished to speak to her. She hurried out and found herself face to face with a porter from the junction, who explained that there had been an accident to the down train at 1:50. "God help us!" exclaimed the governess. "The train Mr. Vanstone travelled by?" "The same. There are 7 passengers badly hurt, and 2—" The next word failed on his lips. He raised his hand in the dead silence. With eyes that opened wide in horror, he pointed over Miss Garth's shoulder. She turned to see her mistress standing on the threshold with staring, vacant eyes. With a dreadful stillness in her voice, she repeated the man's last words. 7 passengers badly hurt, and 2— Then she sank swooning into Miss Garth's arms. From the shock of her husband's death, Mrs. Vanstone never recovered. Heartbroken by the death of their parents, Nora and Magdalen had yet to learn the full extent of the tragedy. That was first made clear to Miss Garth by the lawyer. Mr. Andrew Vanstone in his youth had joined the army and gone to Canada. There he had been entrapped by a woman, whom he had married, a woman so utterly vile and unprincipled that he was forced to leave her and return to England. Shortly afterwards his father died, and having been estranged from his elder son, Michael Vanstone, bequeathed all his property to Andrew. Andrew Vanstone passed his life in a round of vicious pleasures, but as his better nature had almost been destroyed by a woman, so now it was retrieved by a woman. He fell in love, told the girl of his heart the truth about himself, and she, out of the love she bore him, determined to pass the rest of her life by his side, and Nora and Magdalen were the children of their union. "Tell me," said Miss Garth, in a voice faint with emotion, as the lawyer laid bare the sad story. "Why did they go to London?" "They went to London to be married," cried Mr. Pendrell. "In the letter from New Orleans, Mr. Vanstone had heard of the death of his wife, and he had at once taken the necessary steps to make the woman who had so long been his wife, in the eyes of God, his wife in the eyes of the law. The story would never have been known had it not been for Frank's engagement to Magdalen. The soul of honour, Mr. Vanstone thought it his duty to inform Mr. Clare fully regarding his relations with Mrs. Vanstone. His old friend proved himself deeply sympathetic, and then, being a cautious man of business, inquired what steps Mr. Vanstone had taken to provide for his daughters. The master of Combe Raven replied that he had long ago made a will leaving them all he possessed. When Mr. Clare pointed out that his recent marriage automatically destroyed the effect of this testament, he was greatly distressed, and hastening home, had at once telegraphed to Mr. Pendrell to come to Combe Raven to draw up another will without any loss of time. His tragic death had prevented the execution of this plan, and the inability of Mrs. Vanstone to sign any document before she died had resulted in Nora and Magdalen being left absolutely penniless, and the estates passing to Michael Vanstone. "How am I to tell them?" exclaimed Miss Garth. "There is no need to tell them," said a voice behind her. "They know it already. Mr. Vanstone's daughters are nobody's children, and the law leaves them helpless at their uncle's mercy." It was Magdalen who spoke. Magdalen, with a changeless stillness on her white face, and an icy resignation in her steady grey eyes. From under the open window of the room in which Mr. Pendrell had told his story, this girl of 18 had heard every word, and never once betrayed herself. "I understand that my late brother," so ran Michael Vanstone's letter of instruction to his solicitor, "has left 2 illegitimate children, both of them young women who are of an age to earn their own livelihood. Be so good as to tell them that neither you nor I have anything to do with questions of mere sentiment, Let them understand that Providence has restored to me the inheritance that ought always to have been mine, and I will not invite retribution on my own head by assisting those children to continue the imposition which their parents practiced, and by helping them to take a place in the world to which they are not entitled." "Nora," said Magdalen, turning to her sister, "if we both live to grow old, and if ever you forget all we owe to Michael Vanstone, come to me, and I will remind you." Chapter 2. Tricked into Marriage. By fair means or foul, Magdalen, who, with Nora, had now made her home with Miss Garth in London, had sworn to herself that she would win back the property of which she had been robbed by Michael Vanstone. Selling all her jewellery and dresses, she managed to secure £200, and with this sum in her pocket she secretly left home. The theatrical manager, who had offered her an engagement should she ever require it, had moved to York, and it was to that city that Magdalen hastened. Her absence was at once discovered, and Miss Garth resorted to every possible means of tracing her to her destination. A reward of £50 was offered, and her mode of procedure being suspected, handbills setting forth her appearance were posted in York. It was one of these bills that attracted the attention of a certain Captain Ragg. Captain Ragg was the stepson of Mrs. Vanstone's mother, and had persisted in regarding himself as a member of her family, and, having known of the real relationship that existed between his half-sister and Mr. Andrew Vanstone, had obtained from the latter a small annual subsidy as the price of his silence. A confessed rogue, the captain imagined he saw in this handbill an opportunity of restocking his exhausted exchequer. As he wandered on the walls of York, pondering how he should act, he met Magdalen herself, and at once greeted her as a relative. The girl would have avoided him, but on his pointing out that unless she placed herself under his protection she was bound to be discovered and taken back to her friends, she consented to accompany him to his lodgings. There he introduced her to his wife, a tall, gaunt woman with a large, good-natured, vacant face, who lived in a state of bemused terror of her husband, who bullied and dragooned her according to his mood. After listening to the frank exposition of his character and his method of living, Magdalen decided to accept Captain Ragg's assistance. On certain terms, Ragg agreed to train her for the stage and secure her engagements, taking a half share of any money she might earn. In return for these profits, he agreed to carry out certain inquiries whenever she might think it necessary. As to the nature of these inquiries, she, for the time being, preserved silence. Magdalen's talent for acting proved highly successful, and under the direction of the captain she began rapidly to make a reputation for herself, and at the end of 6 months she had saved between £600 and £700. She now decided that it was time to put her plan of retribution into execution. At her instructions, Captain Ragg had discovered that Michael Vanstone was dead, and that his son, Noel Vanstone, had succeeded to the property, and was now living with his father's old housekeeper, a certain Swiss lady, the widow of a professor of science, by name Mrs. Lecount, in Vauxhall Walk, Lambeth. The remaining information that Ragg obtained regarding the Vanstones was to the effect that the deceased Michael had a great friend in Admiral Bartram, whose nephew George was the son of Mr. Andrew Vanstone's sister, and therefore the cousin of Noel Vanstone. Having this information, Magdalen calmly informed Ragg that their alliance for the moment was at an end, and taking Mrs. Ragg with her, journeyed to London. There she obtained rooms directly opposite the house occupied by Noel Vanstone. Disguising herself as Miss Garth, and assuming her old governess's voice and manner, she boldly visited the house. She found Noel Vanstone a weak, avaricious coward, who was already terrified by the letters she had written him demanding the restitution of her fortune. He was completely at the mercy of Mrs. Lecount. Something about the supposed Miss Garth excited the suspicion of Mrs. Lecount, and she deliberately set about to try and make her visitor betray what she was convinced she was concealing. "I would suggest," said Mrs. Lecount, "that you give £100 to each of these unfortunate sisters." "He will repent the insult to the last hour of his life." said Magdalen. The instant that answer passed her lips, she would have given worlds to recall it. Her passionate words had been uttered in her own voice. Mrs. Lecount detected the change, and with a view to establishing some proof of the identity of her visitor, she secured, by a subterfuge, a thin strip of the old-fashioned skirt which Magdalen was wearing in the character of Miss Garth. Foiled in her appeal to Noel Vanstone, Magdalen determined to put in train the plot she had long proposed to herself. She set out deliberately to win the property of which she and her sister had been despoiled by winning the hand of Noel Vanstone. A letter from Frank Clare had released her from her engagement, and with a bitter heart she went down to Aldborough, in Suffolk, whither Noel Vanstone had removed for his health. In the character of the niece of Mr. Bygrave, which role Captain Ragi adopted, she laid siege to the selfish affections of Noel Vanstone. Her task proved ridiculously easy. Noel fell hopelessly in love with her, and before many days were out proposed marriage. So far everything had worked smoothly, but at this point Mrs. Lecount's fears were aroused. She determined to prevent the marriage at all costs, and used every possible means to dissuade her master from having anything more to do with the Bygraves, and the whole plot must have fallen to the ground had it not been for the persistence and skilful diplomacy displayed by Captain Rugg. He arranged that Noel should visit Admiral Bartram, leaving Mrs. Lecount behind to pack up. From Admiral Bartram's he was to proceed to London, where he would be duly united to Magdalen. In order to secure the non-interference of Mrs. Lecount, the captain sent her a forged letter, summoning her at once to the deathbed of her brother at Zurich. But Mrs. Lecount was not so easily disposed of as Captain Ragger had imagined. As soon as her master departed for Admiral Bartram's, she took the opportunity, when both Magdalen and the captain were out, to visit their house. Readily persuading the simple-minded Mrs. Ragg, who had a passion for clothes, to show her Magdalen's wardrobe, she discovered there the skirt from which she had cut a piece on the occasion of the girl's visit in the character of Miss Garth. She was detected by Captain Ragger leaving the house, but careless of what the latter might think, she returned home in triumph. There she found the letter summoning her to Zurich. There was no time to be lost. She had to go. But before she set out, she wrote a letter to Noel Vanstone, disclosing the whole facts of the conspiracy. Captain Ragg, positive in his own mind that Mrs. Lecount had discovered everything, would have consulted Magdalen, but the girl was in a condition which prevented her from taking any active part in the affair. She wandered about Aldborough with a settled despair written clearly on the beautiful features of her face. Her woe-begone appearance attracted the attention of a certain Captain Kirk, and he carried away with him on his ship the indelible memory of her beauty. Captain Ragg had to depend solely on his own exertions. Waiting till the housekeeper had left Aldborough, he discovered, by inquiries at the post office, that Mrs. Lecount had written to Noel Vanstone. That letter must be stopped at all costs, and the captain acted boldly. The day was Saturday. Obtaining a special license, he hurried off to Admiral Bartram's before Mrs. Lecount's letter was delivered, and induced Noel Vanstone to accompany him to London. At the same time, he left behind him several envelopes addressed to Captain Ragger, under cover of which Admiral Bartram was to forward all correspondence which might arrive after his departure. By this means, Mrs. Lecount's letter was prevented from coming into the hands of her master, and 2 days later, Magdalen duly became the wife of Noel Vanstone. 12 weeks later, Noel Vanstone walked moodily about the garden of a cottage he had taken in the Highlands. That morning Magdalen, without even asking his permission, had set out for London to see her sister, and her husband, his health greatly enfeebled, was left alone, weak and miserable. He had a habit of mourning over himself, and as he rested, looking over a fence, he sighed bitterly. "You were happier with me," said a voice at his side. He turned with a scream to see Mrs. Lecount. She told him how his wife was Magdalen Vanstone, how she had married him simply from a desire to recover the fortune of which she had been robbed by Michael Vanstone, also suggesting that Magdalen intended to attempt his life. Shivering with terror, Noel Vanstone became like wax in Mrs. Lecount's hands. He at once agreed to draw up a new will at her dictation, completely cutting off his wife. He bequeathed Mrs. Lecount £5,000 and declared that he wished to leave the remainder to his cousin, George Bartram. Such an arrangement, however, Mrs. Lecount foresaw, might be fraught with those very dangers which she wished to avoid. George Bartram was young and susceptible. It was conceivable that Magdalen, robbed of the stake for which she had so boldly played, might, on her husband's death, attempt to secure the prize by luring George Bartram into a marriage. At the instigation of his housekeeper, Noel Vanstone therefore bequeathed the residue of his estate absolutely to Admiral Bartram. But this will was coupled with a letter addressed to the Admiral, secretly entrusting him to make the estate over to George under certain circumstances. He was to be married to, or to marry within 6 months, a woman who was not a widow. In the event of his not complying with these conditions, which would prevent his marriage with Magdalen, the money was to go to his married sister. Having outwitted Magdalen, Mrs. Lecount's next object was to remove Noel Vanstone down to London. In order that he might be strong enough to travel, Mrs. Lecount prepared a favourite posset for him. Returning with the fragrant mixture, she noticed him sitting at a table, his head resting on his hand, apparently asleep. "Your drink, Mr. Noel," she said, touching him. He took no notice. She looked at him closer. Noel Vanstone was dead. Chapter 3. The Darkest Hour. In pursuance of her determination to discover the secret trust, Magdalen secured a position as parlour-maid in Admiral Bartram's house. For days she waited for an opportunity of examining the Admiral's papers. At night, the Admiral, who was addicted to sleepwalking, was guarded by a drunken old sea-dog called Maisie, and in the daytime she could do nothing without being detected. The secret trust lay heavily on the Admiral's mind, and it became the more unbearable when George Bartram came down and announced his intention of marrying Nora Vanstone. George's married sister was dead, and thus one of the 2 objects contemplated by the secret trust had failed, and only a fortnight remained before the expiry of 6 months in which George Bartram had to marry in order to inherit the fortune. The Admiral objected to the marriage with Nora Vanstone, but was at a loss how to dissuade George from the match. While this problem was occupying the Admiral's attention, Magdalen at last found the chance of examining her master's private apartments. Maisie, under the influence of drink, had deserted his post, and with a basket of keys in her hands, Magdalen crept into the room where the Admiral kept his papers. Drawer after drawer she opened, but nowhere could she find the secret trust. Suddenly she heard a footstep, and turning round quickly she saw coming towards her, in the moonlight, the figure of Admiral Bartram. Transfixed with terror, she watched him coming nearer and nearer. He did not seem to see her, and as he almost brushed past her, she heard him exclaim, "Noel, I don't know where it's safe. I don't know where to put it. Take it back, Noel." Magdalen, realizing that the Admiral was walking in his sleep, followed him closely. He went to a drawer in a cabinet and took out a folded letter, and putting it down before him on the table, repeated mechanically, "Take it back, Noel, take it back." Looking over his shoulder, Magdalen saw that the paper was the secret trust. She watched the Admiral replace it in another cabinet, and then walk back silently to his bed. In another moment she had taken possession of the letter, when a hand was suddenly laid on her wrist, and the voice of old Maisie exclaimed, "Drop it, Jezebel, drop it!" Dragging her away, old Maisie locked her in her room for the night, but early the following morning relented, and allowed her to leave the house. 3 weeks later, Admiral Bartram died, and though Magdalen instructed her solicitors to set up the secret trust, and though the house was searched from top to bottom, the letter could not be found. In consequence, the property passed to George Bartram, who, 2 months later, married Nora Vanstone. Magdalen gave up the struggle in despair, and not daring to return to her people, sunk lower and lower until she reached the depths of poverty. At last, in a wretched quarter in the East End, she came to the end of her resources. Ill and almost dying, the people from whom she rented her one miserable room determined to send her to the workhouse. A crowd collected to watch her departure. She was just about to be carried to a cab when a man pushed his way through the crowd and saw her face. That man was Captain Kirk, who had seen her at Oldborough. He at once gave instructions for her to be taken back into the house, paid a sum down for her proper treatment, and secured the services of a doctor and a nurse. Every day he came to inquire after her, and when at last, after weeks of suffering, her strength returned, it was he who brought Nora and Miss Garth to her. After the long separation, the two sisters had much to tell one another. Nora, who had bowed patiently under her misfortunes, had achieved the very object for which Magdalen had schemed in vain. She had obtained, through her marriage with George Bartram, the fortune which her father had intended for her. Among other things which she related to Magdalen was the account of how she had discovered the secret trust simply by chance. By the discovery of this document, Magdalen became entitled to half her late husband's fortune, for the secret trust having failed, the law had distributed the estate between the deceased's next of kin, half to Magdalen and half to George Bartram. Taking the paper from her sister's hands, Magdalen tore it into pieces. "This paper alone gives me the fortune which I obtained by marrying Noel Vanstone," she said. "I will owe nothing to my past life. I part with it as I part with these torn morsels of paper." To Captain Kirk, Magdalen wrote the complete story of all she had done. She felt it was due to him that he should know all. She awaited the inevitable result, the inevitable separation from the man she had grown to love. When he had read it, he came to her. Near to tears, she waited to hear her fate. "Tell me what you think of me. Tell me the truth," she said. "With my own lips?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Say what you think of me with your own lips." She looked up at him for the first time, and then he stooped and kissed her.